All right, well, this is the first of many in Introduction to the Old Testament. It's going to be like a survey of the Old Testament. It means we're going to quickly go over all the Old Testament. And as we go through it, I'm going to bring up some things that you may not have known. And some of it's going to be like, oh yeah, I knew that. Some of it's going to be, I disagree with you, and that's okay too. Some places I'm going to bring up multiple theories on different items. Because there's areas. If there's someone that you know that wanted to be here tonight and couldn't for whatever reason, I will be posting this to our website, not YouTube, but to our website. Under sermons, you can go to sermons and listen to it there, or you can subscribe to the podcast on either iTunes or on Google Play, or Amazon as well. We have our podcast on there as well, and it will be posted to those as well. So if you know someone that's wanting to make it but couldn't, and of course they can pick up the handouts at the church. We'll have a few extra copies on hand. There they are. They're done talking to God.
Yeah, he's not listening now.
We do have one handout. It's good to see you guys today. When I started naming this, it got pretty long. It was Introduction to Old Testament Studies Survey. And I thought we'd just cut it down. Because this is one of those things that a lot of times we think, I don't know about you, but when I came to the Old Testament, I came to the Old Testament after years of growing up in the church, and so I knew a lot of the stories of the Old Testament, but I had never read the Old Testament. You know, we read the stories. You know, you read you go to Sunday school and you read, I knew Jonah. Of course I knew Jonah. Everyone knows Jonah. I knew, a lot of the good stories of the Old Testament, but I couldn't read the Old Testament. And then when I got into high school, at some point during my high school years, I started looking into the Old Testament, and there was a lot in there I had no idea about. I don't know what any of this means. And then I'd read something in Chronicles, and then I'd read something in Isaiah, and I'd read something, and I'm reading it, and I have no idea. It's all out of context. It's all out of pattern, and I don't know what any of it means. And that's how I came to the Old Testament. So when I started studying the Old Testament, it was like a world came alive to me. And all those stories in the New Testament started making more and more sense. And I still start going to the Old Testament, when I'm reading the New Testament, start going back to the Old Testament. Oh, that's what he meant. And I still get confused. I don't know. We all come to the Old Testament from a different place. Anyone want to share how they came to the Old Testament for the first time? It was the first book you read. A lot of people do. They open the Bible up, and the first thing they flip open to is Genesis. And they make it through Genesis 1. That one's okay. Genesis 2, that one's good. Genesis 3 and 4, and then you hit Genesis 5, and you're like, well, I'm done. Yeah. Okay, so I'm good with the story of Genesis, and then Numbers. Well, there's only 6 names. Oh, that's too much. All those senses, and that's, and a lot of us a lot of us have not read the Old Testament like fully through. Actually, I was in seminary talking to future pastors who had never read the Old Testament fully through because of the same kind of things. They knew the stories, and I imagine that's why some people aren't here tonight, because they know the Old Testament already. And so that's just the way of it. Let me see here. bring up all my remotes and everything else. All my notes. This one. Here we go. Leonardo da Vinci. The painter who draws merely by practice and by eye, without any reason, is like a mirror which opens all the things placed in front of it without being conscious of their existence. When I first read that, after I figured out what it was saying, I thought about all the people that say, I'm a Christian, but they don't know why they believe. You know, like a mirror which copies the things placed in front of it, but has no idea what it really is. And I thought, you know, that's really what it is. You know, if we don't know the Old Testament, if we don't know the Bible, we can't understand the New Testament if you don't know the Old Testament. And so, you say, if I don't know why I believe the Bible, if I don't know what's in the Bible, if I don't know, how can we say we're just conscious, we're just mirrors? And a lot of people I've met, you've met some, I'm sure, you came to Christ because maybe you were one of them at one point in your life. You came to Christ because mom was. Or because dad was. And that's why you came to Christ. And you don't know anything about the Bible, you just knew that that's what they were. Maybe it not even been a real confession. And so that's where, when I started studying the Old Testament, this is one of the things I was thinking about was we need to be conscious of our existence in Christ. So let's ask the question, what is the Old Testament? What does the Old Testament mean to you? Anyone want to give me some ideas? What does the Old Testament mean to you? History. That's a good one. It is full of history. Absolutely. What? Foundation. It is the foundation for our Christian belief. Rules of life. There are a lot of rules on there. 613 of them. The way it began. Prophecy of things to come. There is some of that. The truth of Jesus Christ. Absolutely. When we talk of the Old Testament, first and foremost, it's the Hebrew Bible. It's the Hebrew Bible. It's what Jesus would have read, what Jesus would have known. It's what Paul would have known. When you read your Bible, Jesus often makes reference to the Hebrew Bible. Paul, if you go back and read the book of Hebrews, and you say, I'm going to go reference every place in the Old Testament, you're going to be there for days. I've done this. It references all over the Scriptures. It's the Hebrew Bible. It's what Jesus would have studied, would have known. More than that, it's the product over 1,000 years of life. We're not talking about Genesis 1 through 11 because those are prehistory. But Abraham, we know about when he existed. So about 1200 BC. We know about when he existed, when he was around. That was about the time 1200 BC. To around 200 BC. This is about the time period that the Old Testament was written in. And so it was 1,000 years. So it was 1,000 years. And that's one of the reasons I like it. It means a lot more in some regards than some of the New Testament, because New Testament is telling people how to live in a short period, about 100 years. Acts takes place about 60 years. Old Testament, 1,000 years of life. 1,000 years of people actually living, doing life, and trying to figure out what it means to worship God. Failing. Picking themselves up, trying again. And so it means a lot to us because we have like this overwhelming example of how life works throughout it. It is written in Hebrew and some in Aramaic. So if you're reading it in the original languages, you're going to read it in Hebrew and Aramaic. So you have to be familiar with both of those if you want to go back to that. If you want to look at those languages, the church does provide logos in English, logos in Greek, Bible software, which means the word, Bible software. You can go to logos.com, and the church provides that once you join our Faith Life group and become a member, if you're not already, you get access to Bibles, including the original languages. So that's too complicated for me. I don't want to join you guys. That's your decision. Blue Letter Bible as well. We'll have one, which is another good one. E-Sword is another good one, which is that's really old school. And if you really want to go old school, you can actually borrow one from the library. Not this library. You have to request it because they don't have one physically here. You can request a copy, though. And I have several copies in the Hebrew myself. But this is the Bible in which God shows himself through action and through deeds. And that's one thing I really like about the Old Testament as well. Over those 1,000 years, God shows us himself. Now, we know the ultimate showing of himself is Jesus Christ. But this is how God revealed himself. And these stories are passed along orally, and we're going to talk about that a little later, and written down by men and women through faith throughout time. When we say what's the Old Testament, it is a testament that is sacred to two religions, that would be Christianity and Judaism, and it's highly esteemed by a third. Anyone know the third? Islam. It is highly esteemed by the Islamic faith. This is an important document. It's like, even if I tell people that, when I was teaching college, even if they didn't believe in Christ, they should read the Old Testament. It's an important document for the three largest religions in the world. When we refer to the Old Testament, I'll probably refer to it in multiple ways. The Hebrew Bible will be one way I refer to it. The First Covenant is another way I'll refer to it. The Old Testament, Tanakh, which we'll talk about what Tanakh means here in a minute, and it's on your handout. We'll talk about that in a minute. Tanakh is another way that I refer to the Old Testament, and so all of them just means what Old Testament, what's in your Old Testament. So if I refer to Tanakh, I'm not being weird. I'm just saying that's the Old Testament. As we begin to study, let me see. I guess that's the main question we have to ask ourselves now, is why should I study? So, as you came here tonight, what was the reason you came? Because you could have stayed in bed. Or gone to bed. Or ate dinner at the time you've gotten used to eating dinner at. Or watch whatever is on TV that you're wanting to watch. So be closer to God, to learn. Clarity. Practice to come. Review. My wife has gone through Introduction to Old Testament before. She took college classes. She's got a degree in biblical studies, actually. When I look at the Old Testament, I think, if we're going to be considered people of the Bible, that's what we want to be known as people of the Bible. If we're going to be considered people of the Bible, we can't be just people of the New Testament. A lot of times we're people of the Bible. We love the Bible. We obsess over the Bible. Some people worship the Bible over Jesus. But if we're going to know the Bible, going to be people of the Bible, we have to know what's in it. And in our Bible, if you look in your book, you count it up. There's how many books are in your Old Testament? 39, that's right. Now, I say 39 in yours because it's different numbering in the Hebrew. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. So 39 of your books, your Bible. Now, there's 66 altogether. Do the math. You guys are looking at me. It's too late for math. Look at your calculator. 66 minus 39. 27. That's 27 books in the New Testament. 39 in the Old. That means the majority of the Bible is the Old Testament. So if you're skipping over the Old Testament, you're missing over half the Bible. Another good reason to study, the Old Testament will influence the writings of the New Testament. Some 300 times the Old Testament is quoted in the New Testament. 300 times. And that's not all the times that it's referenced. That's just quoted. And when you're going through it, they don't have, see, the Greeks don't have like quotation marks like we wish they did. Like we have, if I go to quote something, I have to put in quotation marks, put a place where I got it from, and let people know. Which, by the way, I'm taking my material from all over the place, so don't quote me with any of this material. It's from all over the place, and maybe by the end of this thing, I'll actually have my bibliography written out. So, selected bibliography, anyways. The Old Testament shows us how God has actively pursued us with His love, which ends in redemption for us and for His people. And then one of my favorite quotes from my college professor that sometimes I agreed with and sometimes I didn't, and I don't know where he got it from. The Old Testament provides mirrors of identities, not models for morality. Let that sink in there. Mirrors of identity, not models for morality. It shows us who we are, but they're not something we're supposed to look up to and say, I'm going to be just like David. Go sleep with another woman and have her husband killed. I'm going to be just like King Hezekiah. Pray on my deathbed to be relieved and then have the birth of a son that's going to be the evilest king of all of Israel. That's my goal. Mirrors of identity. They show us who we really are. That's really what one of the things the Old Testament does. It shows us who we really are. All right, let's talk Hebrew canon. The Hebrew canon. When we refer to canon, what do we mean? A camera? No. I heard it over here. Standard, yeah. We're not talking about the gun. We're not talking about a camera. We're talking about a standard. This is the rule. Literally, where it comes from is the word that means rule or measuring rod. And so it's like when we say the canon, what is the canon? What books are in the Hebrew Bible? How they're made up. In this case, it's the literature that is held sacred by the Hebrews. You can have different canons, what's in your canon, discussing what, if we talk about Hebrew books, we're going to talk about what's left in the Bible and what's left out, which is actually a really important conversation that people are having right now. Why was this book left out? Why was this one? and you'll hear it a lot. If you're paying attention to Christian studies at all a lot right now, they're talking about, well, what about the book of Enoch? That's a big one. A few years ago when the Da Vinci Code came out. What about the book of Philip? What about the book of Judas or of Thomas, or the book of Jubilees, or the book of the book of War? And what about all these books? And so that's a very important discussion. And it started being discussed as early as 400 BC. So way before Christ was being born, 400 BC, they were discussing, well, what books do we have in there? And we'll get to why this discussion came about when we reach, Ezra and Nehemiah, which is a long ways from now. But we'll discuss some of that stuff. But here's a good one. As we talk about the Hebrew canon. This is from a book called Second Maccabees, which is not in our canon. Now, if you're a good Catholic, you might have read this. But I've discovered most good Catholics actually don't read the Bible. So they've never read it either. But it is in some version of the Bible, like if you buy a Catholic standard, we'll have the book of Maccabees. It says, the same things are reported in the records and the memoirs of Nehemiah, and also founded a library and collected books about the kings and prophets and writings of David and letters and kings about votive offerings. In the same way, Judas also collected all the books that had been lost on account of the war which had come upon us, and then our possessions. So if you have need of them, send your people for them. Oops, right there. For they are in our possession. So and send people to get them for you. It is. There was a lot of books that were being created. A lot of books that people were reading. And so people start asking, well, which ones are actually from God and which ones aren't? Which ones should we read as a group? Which ones are just fun to read? Usually this is determined by common uses and test of time, by many councils and discussions and prayers and process that goes through all this. We're going to talk about a couple of those councils, but we're going to leave most of that alone. We ourselves, as Bible readers, develop our own canons. Think about it. What books of the Bible do you tend to avoid? Numbers. I already heard Numbers. Numbers, that's a good one. Leviticus. So Genesis is in your canon. And it goes Genesis and the Exodus and no, not Leviticus. Some of Leviticus maybe, and no, not Numbers. And then Deuteronomy, is that in your canon? Well, that's kind of repetitive, so maybe we skip that one. Maybe we don't. Joshua, we like Joshua. That's a good one. And the Judges, we know Judges. And Ruth, we like Ruth. And we form our own canons. We do. We all do this. We form books that we like, and we don't. Think about your own reading habits in your own personal, whether it be in the Bible or elsewhere. What kind of books do you guys like? I don't read. We form our own canons. Would be like, well, I'm a mystery person, or I like romance novels, or I like thrillers or true crime, or I like studying ancient places, or we all form our own canons. Here's some optional homework you can do just for fun. Write out what your canon looks like in the Bible, and maybe in film or music or whatever as well. What does your canon look like? It's interesting to actually write these things down and say, well, when I read the Bible, which books don't I tend to read? And it's an interesting study. And when you write it down, you'll be amazed. You're like, well, maybe I should go reread that, or make it a list. This is my. When you find those books that you normally avoid, then that becomes your reading list, right? It's a good study. So optional homework. None of the homework here. We're not in school, so obviously all the homework will be optional. But it's a fun study to do. All right. The Hebrew Bible versus the Protestant Bible. All right, so let's go to your handout. Did everyone get a handout? That handout? We want to be looking at the one that, I don't even have a copy up here. It says Tanakh on it. So you want the side that has the Tanakh on it. Thank you, David. Well, this is his notes. David, you want this copy? This is your notes. I've got a copy on my computer, so it's not a big deal. All right, we'll trade you. Thank you. So the one with Tanakh, it says Tanakh compared with the Christian Old Testament. That's the side we're looking at. The Hebrew Bible, your Hebrew Bible, the acronym is Tanakh. It's divided up into 3 sections: the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketubim, or the Ketubim, depending on which version of the Hebrew you're reading. Torah, which means instructions. Some people translate it as laws, but instruction is actually a much better translation. The Nevi'im, which would be the prophets, and the Ketubim, which is the writings. There are 24 books in this altogether. We see, if you actually start looking at the books, there's 24 because of things like Kings. It's not 1st and 2nd Kings, it's just Kings. It's based on the scrolls. Samuel, same thing. There's no 1st and 2nd Samuel, it's just Samuel. The Megalot, if you look in the Ketubim, that's Ruth, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Lamentation, and Esther. That's just one scroll. We divided it into 5 different sections, so it's just one scroll. It's called the Megalot. Now, one of the first things you should notice is that, so Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, those are in the same order. But after that, we start getting things in different orders. Like, if you look at the history section in our book, Chronicles isn't in the histories, isn't in the prophets. It's not in the next section. It's down there with the Ketubim. Ezra and Nehemiah also in the Ketubim. Different orders. In ours, the Protestants we divide it up into 4 sections. You got the Pentateuch, which means 5 books. And the histories, which, I gotta be honest with you, I don't like calling it just a history. Yes, it is historical, but when we say history, so many people check out. Oh, that's history. And so I have trouble calling it just the histories, because it is more than just the histories. It's the prophets and their words, what God has to say to us. And notice that we refer to like Joshua and Judges as history. Well, they put it as a prophet. Joshua as a prophet. The later prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, we put in the prophet section. We have a poetry and wisdom section, which is 5 books, which we have Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Those are largely in the Ketubim section. And this is not just important because, there's nothing wrong with the way we've divided it up. It's okay. I went through this. I'm reading through the Bible in a year this year. I'm almost done because the year's almost done. Through chronologically, and we go through and look at the books. So you read Acts, and you're reading the different books of Paul as he would have been writing them in the book of Acts, and that's kind of been fun. But Jesus would have studied the Old Testament this way, and he would have been thinking about it this way. Luke 24:44 through 47. Luke 24:44 through 47. And he said to them, "These are my words that I have spoken to you while I was still with you, that everything was written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Then he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures, and he said to them, "Thus it is written that Christ would suffer and would rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance and forgiveness of sins would proclaim in his name to all the nations, beginning from Jerusalem." Notice that? Law of Moses, the prophets, and Psalms. Jesus says it this way because he's referring to all of the Tanakh. The old, he's saying this is what it is. This is the Tanakh. He's thinking about it in the way based on their scroll design. I've got one more verse for you in this one. Luke 11:51. This one's good right here. This one took me a minute. "From the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the temple building. Yes, I will tell you, it will be required of this generation." Okay, who's Abel? Cain's brother. When's that happen? Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4, Cain and Abel story. Okay. Zechariah, son of Jehodiah. It says the blood of, so we're not talking about Zechariah, we're talking about a Zechariah that was murdered. Who knows where that is found? This one took me a moment too. That's right. It's found in 2 Chronicles chapter 24. Now go to your Tanakh. From Genesis, the last book is Chronicles. Jesus is saying from Genesis to Chronicles and everything in between, it must be done. He's saying that this is the Tanakh, this is the study. And so Jesus is referencing this. And of course, when we take it out of order like we do, well, Genesis to Chronicles, that's only about halfway through. We're not even halfway, really. We haven't even gotten to the Psalms yet. So we only need to do half of it. And I think sometimes we meet Christians that's the way our attitude towards Christ is. Well, only half of it matters. But Jesus would have been looking at it this way. I wanted to show you. Let's talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. What you're looking at there is actually the longest of the Dead Sea Scrolls that was found. As we talk about what's the canon, we must stop and talk about some of the important archaeological finds that we've had in dealing with the Old Testament. The Dead Sea Scrolls is probably the most important archaeological find in history. It helps us answer the question why some books are in the canon and which books are not. In 1947, and I thought I had a video here. That's okay. You guys can watch it at home. In 1947, a shepherd boy was hunting for a sheep, and there were 5 of them, I think, altogether, but a shepherd boy came across some caves with scrolls sealed in the clay pots. And they were books in the Old Testament inside these clay pots. Now, they were from the Qumran and Essene community. Essenes are a type of Jewish people outside of Jerusalem. And what happened, we think, is, see, the Essene community, if you're up on the Essene community, the caves are over that way. What we think happened is when Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70, the Essenes knew it was destroyed and started hiding their work in the caves for when the Roman army came down, and the Roman army did come down and destroy the Essenes as well. So they hid their work in these caves. And so it wasn't until 1947, it was actually an interesting story. We didn't find out about them until they come up on the black market. It was in the 1940s when it came up on a New York Post. Someone was selling one of the scrolls, and so people started looking at, what is this? And they found it, and they found all this stuff about this stuff. I'll put a link in our Faith Life. If you're on Faith Life, I'll put a link for optional homework with a video of some of that on there after the service, after we're done here. I'll go ahead and post it. And so we'll have a video of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I do have. Let me come back to this slide in just a second. Well, we can stay here at this slide. I'm going to need to go back to the back for just a second. I can't control this one from up here. All right. Let's see. There's my. All right. This is a website you can actually go to. It's the Digital Dead Sea Scrolls, and you can type it in. And if you're following along right now with Faith Life, there'll be a signal on the presentation that will actually bring you to the website right now. But it is the dds.collections.imj.org. And I'll try to remember to put that on the Faith Life as well. But if you look at this is the Great Scroll of Isaiah that you can see right here in front of us. And these were what the scrolls in Qumran would have looked like. And these are actually in leather. And you can see how it's written in Hebrew. Scroll is interesting. When they would make a mistake, they would make a little tally, and sometimes that would stick with it for a long time. There's a spot that was ripped. Here's where it was sewed together, and there's a place where a hole had developed. Right here, you can see there was a hole that had developed, and someone sewed it back together. And right here, you'll be able to see the stitches that sewed the seams together. This one on the DDS, if you click on it, it'll actually show you what the verse is in the Hebrew in the Bible, in the scroll of Isaiah. So, but that's what these scrolls we're looking at as we talk about and you can see where the stitching has come out here on this one. But this is the Great Scroll of Isaiah that was found in Qumran. Now, this is one of the most intact versions. There are other scrolls that we found there at the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here. Oops, wrong one. Close that out. There we go. Here we see this is the temple scroll, and this is what some of them look like. We can pick out what some of it meant and some of it said, and we can place it in some other books that we have, and so it provides us with dating and stuff like that. But here it's really incomplete. But this is what the Dead Sea Scrolls are, a wonderful example of archaeology and our scriptures. This is the book of Habakkuk. Here. Would have been collected at Qumran. All right, let me come back around. All right. Mm-hmm.
We were fortunate to see the Dead Sea Scrolls
Were you?
in San Diego. What was fascinating to me was that some of them were done in copper.
Yes, some of them were done in copper.
Piecing together by the Jewish Israeli Museum was a phenomenal effort to try and make them whole. And like you say, Isaiah was the best.
Yeah, that's the biggest one. It was fascinating. That's amazing. I'd love to see him in person. I'm thankful we have the internet now where I can see digital copies. When we talk about the canon, so we had the Dead Sea Scrolls, but a lot of where our stuff comes from is from the Council of Jamnia in AD 90, which this council came together for the purpose of setting up the Hebrew canon, the Old Testament. And they did this because of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 by the Romans. They destroyed the temple. But also, they were no longer the religious center. And then there was this upshoot of this other religion coming around called Christianity. And so the Hebrews got together and said, well, which ones are actually scripture for us and which one are not? And so the New Testament was going on. So the Council of Jamnia were like saying, which ones should we actually follow as our book? So the Tanakh was formed really as a result because Christianity was coming apart around. As other reasons, destruction of the homeland, which always forces you to look and say, well, what's important to us? And there were also other Jewish writings that were coming about as well. And so they needed to unify on this. In our studies, in our translations, before the Dead Sea Scrolls came about, and we saw some of this stuff in actually Hebrew, our oldest version of the Bible was not in Hebrew. The oldest version of the Bible we actually had was in Greek. Because in BC 250 BC, the Septuagint was created, the LXX 70. So they came together and they created a Greek version of the Bible because Greek became the common language of the people. The average person, unless you were trained in the temple, you couldn't read the Hebrew. So they sat down and they created the Greek version so that normal people could come and read it. And so one of our oldest translations about it, of the Bible, and some of the things we understand about the Bible, and King James Version of the Bible relied heavily on the Septuagint because it was what they had access to versus some of the stuff we have access to now, like because of finds like the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the story goes that 70 priests got together in 70 days and translated the Hebrew to Greek. That was the story, anyways. And before the DSS, the Dead Sea Scrolls, was found, this is the most important find for our textual research. Our best Hebrew Bible, anyone guess as to when it dates from? About AD 1000. So about 1,000 years after Jesus is our best Hebrew version of the Bible. And it contains 15 extra books that are added to the Ketuvim. We call it the Apocrypha, which means hidden. And it seems the people who wrote the New Testament knew about these other writings. And you read the book of Jude, he clearly makes reference to the book of Enoch. Even though we don't call them as scripture, it is important that we actually look at some of these books as well because of the importance of them. And because they knew about them, and the Roman Catholics, the Orthodox Bibles, even the 1611 King James Version of the Bible. The 1611 is the first King James Version of the Bible. The version of the King James you're reading is not the original King James Version of the Bible. The 1611 actually has the Apocrypha in it, but it was later removed for various reasons. And I'm going to post some other optional videos to watch that if you want to dive more into this topic that I don't want to spend too much time on because we won't get through the Old Testament. But I'll post some videos on that we have access to if you're on Faith Life TV. The church provides access to these things. And so there's like a three video course that you can take on how the canon of the Bible got started and canonized. So I'll post that as soon as I go back to the office. So do we have any questions on that? Yeah.
We believe that we have a complete canon of scriptures.
Yes.
What we hold in our hands is the inspired word of God.
Yes.
The rest of these books, they're not considered inspired.
They're not considered inspired, but that doesn't make them not important. We consider we have the inspired work of God, and we base this off of many councils, prayer, long time use, things like the Council of Yamnia, the Septuagint, the finds at the Dead Sea Scroll. We think we can say that, and we trust God to have said, okay, these are the books that remain. But that doesn't mean that the other books like Enoch is not important, because clearly, like when you read Jude, he references the book of Enoch. He would have been thinking of some of these other books that may not be scriptural, but not important, but just important. And we have some of these books today. Like if you were to reference some of the things that are important in our day and age, a Left Behind series. That was a very important series that I personally do not like, but very important for us. Dante's Inferno, the Divine Comedy, very important in our understanding, in the way we look at the world. Aristotle, his Republic is very important for us in the United States today. Harry Potter, very important book for today's generations. Star Wars. Amazed at how many people look at the world through Star Wars, though it's clearly Taoist workings. It's Taoist, which is a type of religion. But yeah, so we have those. So they're important books, but not inspired works.
Pastor Ryan?
Yeah.
In movies and everything, they always talk about the Torah. So is the Torah only the 5 books at all the times, or do they reference the whole?
Sometimes they refer to the Torah as all of the books, but usually no. Usually it's just the five books of Moses is what they call it, even though Moses didn't write them all. And we'll talk about that next Tuesday. But the Mishnah and the Talmud, these are commentaries on the Tanakh. So you have the Tanakh, which they believe are inspired, and the Mishnah and the Talmud are commentaries that were about that. Mishnah are teachings, and Talmud and you can, many Jews still read the Talmud. It takes about 7 years if you read a section a day, a page a day. And many Jews still do it. Every day they read their section of the Talmud. And you can download, if you want to get into that, you can download the Jerusalem. There's two Talmuds, actually. The Babylonian and the Jerusalem Talmuds, commentaries. And often when I say, you'll hear me from the pulpit or in class, you'll say, tradition holds. A lot of times I'm actually referencing one of the Talmuds or a Greek historian or another historian or stuff like that. But often it's from a Talmud that I'm referencing. I'm just not going to tell you it's from the Talmud, that's this and this, because it's not important. But Talmud and Mishnah, these are commentaries. So and they become, for many Jews, the Talmud becomes just as important as the scriptures, but they're not supposed to. A rabbi will tell you that they're important, but they're not equal to scriptures. But that doesn't stop it from happening. Of course, we see this in our own lives too, don't we? What do we put equal to scriptures that shouldn't be there? I mean, even our understanding of the Old Testament, heaven and hell, that's a wonderful example of what does the Bible actually say about heaven and hell? And what is from Greek or like Dante's Inferno or Divine Comedy? Very important for our understanding of heaven and hell, because the Bible leaves a lot of things blank. So these people are like, these writers wrote things, and so they became our traditions. And they shouldn't be, but they are. Anything else? Any other questions? All right, we're running out of time. I'm trying to decide if I have time to get through the next section. And I do not. So unless you guys want to stay, or we can go, we get out at 7, or we just stay. It's up to you guys. You want to stay, stick around? Does anyone have anywhere to need to go? You guys need to stand up and stretch? Why don't we take a little break? If we're going to stick around, why don't we take a little break, stretch our legs, and we'll come back in a few minutes, and we'll pick up with the Old Testament story, the flip side of that piece of paper I gave you. All right, let's go ahead and come back together. Sorry, I didn't mean to give you a heart attack right here on. All right, we won't finish all this tonight, but we can do the back side of that paper I gave you on development of story. One of the things we're talking about is, how did the Old Testament get written? And when we do that, we have to talk about how story comes about. And it comes about and this is an abbreviated form, and we'll go to your paper in just a minute. Something happens, and this is when any story develops, whether it be the Bible or tomorrow's news, or well, of course, something doesn't have to happen from the news anymore. But But something happens and story develops, which is how we interpret that developing. And in order for it to be a story, it can't be a secret, so we have to tell someone else. And then reinterpretation of the story, looking back on it after time has passed, with 20/20 vision that we have, through our clouded eyes because we're 20/20 seeing through our own biases. That's how story develops. So let's look at that paper you have. That's that handout you have on the back side of the Tanakh one. If we want to reconstruct the way that a group of texts like the Hebrew Bible come about into existence, and we're going to use the Bible as our guide, we're also going to use some other ancient Near East. When I say ancient Near East, what am I saying? That's what I was afraid of. Okay, we have the West and the East, right? West is really what we consider Rome and into the United States, the West, development of the West. The East is what we consider like Oriental, India and Egypt and China, Asian countries, Japan, that's the East. So it's kind of a dividing line, how we divide the world. Even today, when you read your history books or just travel, you're going to talk about, are you going to the East or the West? Even though if you continue hitting West, you're going to hit the East. But we divided the world. So when I say the Near East, it's the section that is nearer to the West than, say, the Far East, which would be like China and Asia. So the Near East is the part that's closer to and that would be things like Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan. We're fighting wars in the Near East. Then I add on the word ancient. So that means far back in time. So the old Near East. And so we're going to be writing times from ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Israel, ancient Egypt. We're going to be looking at some. We'll use those as guides as well. When I stole this from someone else. No, this is I took this from a Dr. Tim Mackey, which you can follow online. The Bible Project is where he can be found. So I took this from him. But we begin with stuff happens. Abraham, let's say Abraham. The life of Abraham actually has to happen for a story to develop about it. Now we can make believe some stuff if we want to, but there has, but this is a story where actually, something happens. Abraham happened. Exodus happens. The wilderness wandering happens. Mount Sinai happened. And in order for it to become a story, the people who actually lived through it have to remember it. If you don't remember it, it becomes lost to time, right? Think about your own Christmases. If you don't remember that Christmas, it's not one of the stories you tell, right? And we're going to be telling a lot of Christmas stories coming up, right? All the Christmas stories that we tell. And there are Christmases that nothing happened. I wonder if 2020 will be one of those Christmases that nothing happens or that we remember it was the year of COVID. Will it be a story or not? I guess we'll only know after the fact, won't we? In the ancient, in the pre-literate or non-literate societies, the ancient Israel, the ancient Near East, they would remember things orally. And in Asia, there's a whole historians and sociologists that study this stuff, and they're way more geeky than I am, which is pretty geeky. And it's really kind of boring work in my opinion. But they survey all the existing texts and all the archaeological data, and under 5% of most of these societies of people who have learned to write and write and learn and read. Only 5% of them had learned to do anything more than just tell oral stories. How blessed are we that most of our people know how to read? And we don't read, which really is unfortunate if we don't, because we're not reading, and it was such a gift. And just because you learn how to read doesn't mean you know how to write, because writing requires access to materials, and we are so blessed. I have more pens at my house than Star knows what to do with. We have more paper. And that's actually a really interesting study, and if we do an introduction to New Testament, we'll talk about how Paul wrote his letters and what was all involved with that. But writing required access to materials that most people didn't have access to, whether it be clay and the chisels that were required to make cuneiform, or stone and the chisels that are required to make into stone, and that's not easy. And lead didn't exist back then, and there's carving into leather and metals, and it's a very expensive process. We forget how expensive writing actually was in the ancient world. And we can write whenever we want. You can just type it up if you want. You don't actually have to know handwriting. You can just type, which is a good thing for me. Because my handwriting is atrocious. And, so we're thankful for that. And so the people they remembered their stories, and they remembered them for a long time, and they had training in how to remember stories, and retelling and remembering oral stories. And I don't want us to think of that game Telephone. You guys ever play that game Telephone? Remember that in school, right? You'd say something to person A, and by the time you get to person Z, it's not even close to where it was. That is not what we're to think about when we think about this. They were actually good at memorizing things. The human mind is capable of so much. It's amazing. When Plato and Aristotle, they were actually against us writing things down, because they said when we didn't have to remember them, we would lose so much. And even now, of our ability to think, and even now, we have, how much of it, well, I can always look that up later. If I don't need to memorize that, I can just look it up. And that's our attitude, and we've lost a lot of our ability to think, because thinking, in order to think, we have to have an encyclopedia, dictionary inside our head. And if you have to look it up later, that's not there for you to think off of. And so our ability to think has actually been somewhat lost, because we're not memorizing things. And, and they were also, like, these were stories that were told all the time. And if you go back and look at the Jewish calendar, which we will at some point during this class, they had different events that told the same stories every year, that you go through the same stories and you read through the scriptures, and so that if someone tries to change something, everyone knows. I mean, you can think about your uncle, right? And that story gets longer every year, and someone has to remind them that's not how it actually happened. They were good about this. They were really good about memorizing and learning how to write, and how to. And it wasn't until really late, when we see scriptures actually being written. Some things were written before, like we'll talk about, like the Torah being written by Moses and his around that time period. But a lot of stuff wasn't written down till actually the time of the Babylonian exile, when they no longer had access to the people that knew the stories. And so, and we'll talk about that when it comes about that. But so there's a community or oral history, and they never wrote it down. They just knew it. They learned it. From a very young age, they were hearing the stories. And this is the original stories. Different cultures have fixed mechanisms and practices for how they preserve tradition, and some of this is musical and poetic. Look at the book of Judges. You actually have two stories in the book of Deborah. One of them is a poetry version, probably the older version of the story, because it was a way that they could memorize it in the poetic rhyme that would keep the story in their head. We memorize song. How many of you guys know the songs a lot better than you do like your history book, right? But if you knew a song about it, and so they were the same way. They knew the songs and stuff like that. Who's the first writer of the Bible? Who's the first writer that the Bible mentions? Moses. Doesn't appear on page 1? No, it's actually an oral history long before Moses got there. When we talk about Adam and Eve and stuff like that, that was all oral history that was probably collected over time. At some point, these oral traditions take a written form, and they form early written traditions. And so by the time, if you look at so it forms those early traditions. Some of these we have access to, like the scroll of generations of humanity, the scroll of Yasher. And actually, you can go online and find a book called Yasher. It's probably not the same one. Joshua 17 says, "The sun stood still and the moon stopped, and the nation took vengeance on its enemy. Is it not written in the scroll of Yasher? The sun stood still, and the middle of the heavens was not haste for the full day." Now, I've read the book of Yasher. I have a copy of it back there in my office that we have. This is probably not the same book. The book I have in my office, which is the current book of Yasher, is full of all kinds of discrepancies and things that go against the scriptures and other places in the scriptures. And my favorite is Cain killed Abel with a piece of iron, which is possible, but even the scripture says iron didn't come around until after Abel, and an iron plow, nonetheless, which didn't come about till much, much later. The scroll of Yasher. Yasher is most likely an ancient Hebrew word from the word to sing. And so it was another, a song book written down in the book to sing. The most ancient forms of writing that came to the ancient Near East are either receipts and deeds for sale, or land or marriage, or poetic narratives that retell events of people's lives. They are songs, and most of our ancient works are songs. And so that's kind of gives us a hint of how the Bible first started about. That was probably poetic works and songs. And actually, a lot of the Hebrew, when you go and read it, actually has kind of a poetic sound to it. And no, I'm not going to sing it. And you can say thank you later. But it tells us the oldest form of Israelite narratives, tradition, were probably poetic. Epic poems and narratives found in the Babylonian literature and Canaanite literatures. In Numbers, we hear the scroll of the wars of Yahweh. That's kind of intense, isn't it? We don't actually have any record of that one. And when you're reading the book of Kings, you're reading the history of the monarchy of Israel, and the author tells you at the depth of every king, listen, I didn't include everything. So he basically says, go and look in the scrolls and the archives of the kings of Israel and Judah, and you can get the full story. That's in the book of Kings, paraphrased. So your oral traditions at some point getting written down, and these get into collections, and then collections get brought into collections, and that gives you what's called proto or first editions of the biblical books, and here are some examples that Proverbs of Solomon, Prayer of David, son of Jesse, is Psalm 72. Mosaic True Torah, the first editions of Jeremiah are all probably proto-editions of the books that we have. And this can sound kind of scary because a lot of times we want to say like, oh, God just zapped it onto golden tablets, right? A very Mormon idea, by the way, that God just works into existence. And that's what we want to think about, because if it wasn't written by one person or by tablets falling from the sky, then somehow we a lot of times we think that it loses its authority. When it's zapped from the sky, we say, okay, this is from God. But when so many people are involved, it kind of makes us nervous. And I think we're so used in our culture to look at the news. Look at the news today. How quickly a story spins out of control. And for us to imagine that people cared so much to preserve it the way it actually happened is beyond a lot of our way of thinking, because it's just not the way we think. And so they were careful to preserve it best as possible, adding things and being careful about what they're adding or taking out, and making sure it stays true to the story. It's really hard for us not to think about pushing our own agendas when we write. We're a very divided nation right now, and everyone's pushing their own agendas. It's hard for us to think that someone else wouldn't do that because they believed it to be holy. And as the story develops, we interpret events. We interpret events, and what we call history. And when we talk about history as interpreted events, there's a lot of times we want to say, well, what's the true history? What's the pure history? And unfortunately, there's no such thing as pure history. There's no such thing as pure history, because everyone, even all of us, even as we look back on time, we're looking through with our own biases. We have our own biases. We see the world through a lens, and that involves our background, our culture, our ethnicity, our social economic status, our education levels. Events that happened in, like, an American looking back on history tend to see everything through the Atlantic slave trade. In Europe, they don't look at everything through the Atlantic slave trade. And so that's a very different thing. If you're poor, you look at the scriptures differently than if you're got a lot of money. Where you grew up. Whether you grew up with hearing the stories of the scriptures, or whether this is the first time you've ever opened the scriptures. And we look back at history a lot of different, in our culture. And even if we were to say all of that, the Bible is written through what the Germans call Hilfsgeschichte, which is a mouthful, right? It means a healing story or salvation history. We look through the Old Testament through the light of Jesus Christ, which I'm going to say sometimes we have to hold back on that, because I'm going to point out some things that, to the people it meant this, and then we can look at the light of Jesus Christ. But often we look through the Old Testament through the life of Jesus, and so it's we don't have such thing as a pure history. And the Bible itself is not written to be a pure history. I think sometimes when we tear that word history in there, right? We kind of say that's what we want is a pure history, but that's not what the Bible was written for. The Bible never claims to be a pure history. Never claims it. It's a Bible about God. It's a book about God. And the Bible means book. It's a book about God and his interaction with people. And we look back on history through the light of Jesus Christ. The primary bias of the Old Testament is it's inspired by God. I'm trying to decide how much I want to go to. All right, 2 Timothy 3:15 through 16. And you know that from infancy you have known the sacred scriptures, which are available to give wisdom for salvation through Christ Jesus. All scripture is inspired by God and is profitable for teaching, for rebuking, for correcting, for training in righteousness. So all scripture is for what is right, what is wrong, how to get right, and how to stay right. That's the summary of that. Jeez. You know what? It's 7:30. Why don't we say for what inspiration means for next Tuesday? I kind of feel like I've overwhelmed you with information already. Why don't we stop there, inspiration, and we'll come back to that next Tuesday. Yeah.
You know, our pastor back in South Dakota has kind of tried to get us to do something that, I don't know, most of us maybe don't do enough, but to do some journaling. And this is a way of maybe leaving a story behind of what has done in our lives, how God has used this, different things.
That's a wonderful thing. Journaling is great. I wish I was more of a journaler. I've already stated that my writing is atrocious, and I don't take the time to type it out. But journaling is a wonderful thing. Anything else we want to say before we close? Thank you. You're welcome. Someone to close us in prayer. Who wants to close us in prayer?
I will.
All right, thank you.
Father, we thank you for the opportunities that you provided for us in this church and for the incredible value of Pastor Ryan and his will to teach us and to bring us closer to where you want us to know. We thank you so much for what we've learned tonight. We ask that you get us all home safely and back on Sunday morning. In your very precious name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. You guys have a good week. We'll see you Sunday.